Hello, everybody. Yes, thank you, Brianna. So yes, my presentation is going to be based on data collected very early in the pandemic, and it's a simple descriptive snapshot of what was happening within separated families at that time. These findings were published back in September 2020 as an LSE case briefing paper with my co-author, Steve McKay from the University of Lincoln. Okay. Right. So since the first lockdown, there has been a lot of coverage that we've all seen on how families have coped during the pandemic. So we've heard a lot about homeschooling and gender roles and various other things about what's happening within families. So in the press and social media, and now there are a number of really great academic papers coming out. But these largely overlook the 3.5 million children who live in separated families. So these are children who don't live with both of their parents for most of the time. So they either live with only one parent or they move between their parents. And the pandemic's had particular ramifications for these separated families. Firstly, there have been a number of barriers to children seeing their non-resident parents in the usual patterns that they might see them. This may have been kind of most pronounced during periods of lockdown, but it has been present throughout. So we've got issues such as advice against non-essential travel, the risks of using public transport, increased working hours for frontline workers, the kind of risks of moving between households, periods of where people have had to socially isolate. And also early on I haven't heard so much recently, but about parents where there's already conflict about contact, maybe quotes using the pandemic to help change arrangements. So although, despite the fact that very early on the government guidelines were that if a child lived with only one of their parents and saw the other parents, then they could move between those two households and belong to both households. What happened in practice was a matter for the parents to decide. Second particular ramification for separated parents is, and their children, is their ability for the non-resident parent to financially support their child in the form of child maintenance, because furlough, redundancy, precarious working arrangements may have affected the capacity or actually the liability of non-resident parents to pay child maintenance or maintenance at the level they were paying before. Now, this is a real issue that we need to understand how COVID-19 has affected things for these separated families, because we know from existing evidence that the relationships that children have with their parents and the income coming into their household both affect children's well-being in the short term and their outcomes in the longer term. So the data that I'm going to be talking about here is from the Understanding Society COVID-19 study that Brianna has so well introduced already, so that I won't go into a lot of detail here, apart from to say thank you to Understanding Society for having launched this so quickly and being so quick off the mark to collect these data. The data I'm talking about was collected from separated parents in the June 2020 online COVID wave. I'm focusing here on the 480 resident parents. So these are the parents where the child lives for most of the time. There were some question asks of non-resident parents, but for a number of reasons about the data, I'm concentrating here on the resident parents. And they were asked questions about contact between the child and the non-resident parent, the closeness of that relationship, and child maintenance. So thinking firstly about relationships and contact, a question was asked about how close a child was with their non-resident parent. So it was a 4-point scale from very close to not at all close. And that question was a general question which captured their relationships kind of regardless of the pandemic. And then there was a follow-up question which asked whether now their relationship was better, worse, or the same as before the pandemic. And there were also a duo of questions which asked about the frequency of contact between the non-resident parent and the child prior to the pandemic, and in the 4 weeks prior to the resident parent filling in the surveys, which would have been during kind of May, June. Okay. So in terms of firstly, what happened to relationships? So the good news is that in these early months of the pandemic, resident parents reported in the main the relationship between the non-resident parent and the child was stable, or so about 73% said the same and about 6% said it improved. What's more concerning is the 14% that said the relationship had deteriorated even in this early stage. And the relationships that were more likely to deteriorate were ones where the relationship quality was already poorer or where there was already less contact prior to the pandemic. So this chart that I'm going to show here, this is showing the relationship between the closeness of the relationship between the child and the non-resident parent. So across the top, we've got from very close to not at all. And then compared to before, better, about the same, or worse. And the line that I'm most interested in highlighting here is the worst line, where you'll see that the proportion of resident parents who said the relationship got worse is around a fifth to a quarter amongst those who said that the relationship was already not very or not at all close prior to the pandemic. And although these are relatively small numbers, I should have said early on that once we look at some of these questions, the sample sizes are quite modest. But even with these modest sample sizes, this is a statistically significant difference across the piece. The story about contact is slightly more complex, partly because of the way the questions are asked in terms of interpretation. So this is contact. I need to stress this is contact, not just necessarily seeing the non-resident parent. Okay, so in terms of contact, again, the level of contact remained largely stable, which is the good news. But there were substantial minorities in less contact, and then some actually who had less contact before had more contact in recent times. So that again is a good news, an indication of a good news story. So in terms of contact here across the top, we've got the frequency of contact prior to the pandemic, split into 3 frequency groups, and then down the side in the past 4 weeks. And highlighted in the green figures, we'll see that those people who are seeing the children are seeing the non-resident parents relatively frequently prior to the pandemic, there were kind of substantial minorities who were seeing them less in the last month. So for those who were seeing them once a week or more, for instance, you've got 18% seeing them several times a month and 13% only seeing them once a month, less often or never. So again, this is what's going on early on, and it would be good to know what was happening more recently. So finally, the final point I wanted to make was around child maintenance. Now, June 2020 was very early to be able to assess the impacts or the associations of COVID-19 on maintenance. We had the buffer of the furlough scheme, and it was very far from us seeing the full economic impact of the pandemic. But nonetheless useful to know what was happening at this time. The resident parent was asked whether they had a maintenance arrangement. And note, this doesn't necessarily mean they were receiving any maintenance under that arrangement. We can have an arrangement where it's actually not working. 46% they had an arrangement. And then they were asked whether they received more or less or the same in the past 4 weeks as before. Given we're talking about 46% of already a modest sample size, the samples here asking about the child maintenance are modest and need to be treated as kind of an indicative, I would say. In terms of what had happened with child maintenance, if people had an arrangement, 87% of those said they were still receiving the same. Note, that could mean that they weren't receiving very much or not receiving anything. But even at this early stage, 1 in 8 said they were receiving less or receiving none. And they were most likely to say this was to do with furlough, redundancy, or reduction in self-employed earnings. And again, what's most worrying is the signs that those with less contact were those most at risk. So less contact prior to the pandemic were most at risk of potentially their maintenance reducing during the pandemic. So this has the frequency of contact between children and non-resident parents prior to the pandemic, again split into 3 groups across the top. And then in the past 4 weeks compared to before the pandemic, whether they were receiving more, about the same, or receiving less or no maintenance. This is a non-significant pattern here, given the sample sizes we're talking about, they're just over 100 cases. But nonetheless, we're seeing that those who are saying they're receiving less or none, they're more likely to be saying that if they had less contact prior to the pandemic. So in terms of summing up, my final slide, what I would say is, okay, the summing up of the early days. So say the good news is that during the first lockdown, relationships that were solid and contact patterns that were regular appeared to have weathered the storm at this time. But they were early signs that those with poorer quality relationships were the most likely to suffer. Now, this is particularly concerning given that we're talking about the start of many months of further restrictions. So there have been restrictions that have been going on for, however many, 10 months since these data were collected. And again, most arrangements at that time weren't affected, but that was very early on in the proceedings. So it's very important, given, as I said at the start, about the importance of these relationships with non-resident parents with their children, it's very important for us to be able to monitor the longer term trends of actually what's happened in separated families as a result, during and as a result of the pandemic. And we're lucky that will be interesting to see, we'll be able to have a look at this in more detail at wave 11 of the Understanding Society and in future waves. And my final slide is just where you can find the publication. Okay, thank you very much.